Let's talk more about this as we are joined via Skype from New York City by Betsy McCoy. Betsy, of course, the former lieutenant governor of the Empire State, and via Skype from Newsmax, Washington, John Griffing. John serves as an associate editor for a publication I really like to read online, The Daily Caller. So, John, let me run this theory by you. Minnesota and Washington State, two states lurching to the left, utilize their good offices to go court shopping, especially Washington State, knowing that it is in the Ninth Circuit, where the justices are decidedly leftward, and they understood politically what they were doing by lining this up with a federal judge in Seattle and then having it turned over to the Ninth Circuit in San Francisco. Do you disagree with that theory?
I disagree with anything that violates settled case law, settled precedent. Let the decision stand, stare decisis. Liberals seem to think that that only applies when it serves their political agenda. And there's a host of evidence showing that when a president uses his executive authority to, say, ignore the status of people here illegally or grant them relief, as Obama did and presidents before him have done, liberals have no problem with this kind of use of executive authority. They simply have a problem with us actually enforcing our borders and actually protecting the American people from groups like ISIS and the 9/11 hijackers, all of whom were illegal immigrants.
Basically, could it be considered a suicide clause, actually using the Constitution to hasten our own problems in terms of national security?
Yes, JD, absolutely. In fact, if you look at the Soviet Union, I mean, or Germany, circa 1933, all of these things were accomplished with a vote, with a democratic vote. But simply voting one time to end all voting is not really the democratic process we're used to here in the West. So, no, I would argue that a judge, not only, he in this case, is he exceeding his authority, the limits on his power established by the Constitution, but he's violating established, settled precedent on the issue of immigration and the authority it gives the president to act in these kinds of cases. I cite specifically INS v. Chadha from 1983. This case has come up repeatedly in the last 20 years, and the court, the High Court, Supreme Court, consistently decides in favor of the president in repelling and expelling threats to the country.
And it will probably end up at the Supreme Court, as Miranda Khan mentioned, because it is of such national importance and obviously something where time is of the essence, and that time is being frittered away. Speaking of the four-letter word known as time, Betsy, John, we want you to stay right where you are because we need your comments on some other matters. Let's talk more about this by bringing back our panel, again via Skype from New York City, Betsy McCoy, former lieutenant governor of New York, and from Newsmax, Washington, John Griffing. John, associate editor for The Daily Caller.
Putin's a killer. A lot of killers.
He seems to me to understand, hey, you don't go around calling another leader of a country a killer. Had he done that, the headlines today would be Trump calls Putin a killer.
Exactly, JD. The idea that Fox or any in the media would expect the President of the United States to accost verbally the leader of the only other major nuclear power in the world after such tense and dicey foreign policy between our two countries over the last 8 years is laughable, and it's part of this narrative, JD. They can't prove the narrative, so they keep trying to find ways to frame interviews like this in that light, and it's just laughable.
Yeah, but this is a false comparison, is it not, John? We're not talking about domestic political violence, are we?
Well, this is a false dichotomy, but number one, let's remember that Ted Kennedy actually did request that the General Secretary of the Soviet Union then, in memorandums, this is documented, intervene in the 1984 elections to kill Reagan's chances and to set him up to be president. I mean, the idea that Trump, who has no proven connections to Russia, simply trying to ride the fence and make sure he's not attacking the only other major nuclear power is somehow an evidence of his, his compliance with Russian foreign policy objectives. That's absurd, and we need to get away from the campaign of 2016. Marco Rubio, I respect the guy. He needs to stop campaigning.
That's right. Senator Rubio has not gotten over the fact that Donald Trump called him Little Marco and put him in his place.
Right.
Boy, they are delighting, John, in the fact that they said one thing and now they're doing something else. Your take.
Well, this is peace in our time, Neville Chamberlain personified. I mean, this is a man, Obama, our former president, who gave Iran $400 million, gave them a drone. Dick Cheney was furious when the president allowed the drone to be captured by the Iranians. This is the president we're talking about. He was worse than Jimmy Carter, who crashed helicopters into the desert.
Yes, and joining us now to discuss that, investigative journalist John Griffing, also a contributor to the National Review and the American Thinker. The president, of course, a lot of folks tuning into that interview yesterday, wanting to hear what he had to say after issuing those executive orders. What are we missing here?
Well, number one, the Republicans are taking action that is largely symbolic, and we're failing to realize that this problem is merely the manifestation, the latest manifestation in a long history since Reagan of abusive executive action that is only worsened with time. It's like compound interest. So we have something now that on its surface is yet the most brazen display of abusive executive power. I mean, essentially writing law, which Obama has been doing since he took office, by the way. And yet we're failing to realize that this is a bipartisan problem. Our party, the Republican Party, in my case, is choosing to make this a partisan issue and turn this into a midterm bludgeon and hopefully catapult one of our candidates to the White House. But regardless, this is something that has been a problem for both parties, and it needs to be addressed with the mechanisms put in place in the Constitution, namely, in this case, impeachment. Lawsuits are not going to accomplish the purpose of restructuring and rebalancing power in favor of the people, in favor of our legislative representatives, and that all needs to start with a bolder step. And I think what we're seeing right now is largely symbolic.
Presidents have used many different kinds of executive instruments to bypass Congress. Is this somewhat like comparing apples to oranges, would you say?
No, because, like Bush with signing statements, for example, the effect is to write law. In Bush's case, he, in most of those instances, using signing statements, would eliminate portions of law that he did not want to enforce, and he would say so in his signing statement. Reagan, less impact there. Reagan had, used, I think, executive orders a couple times to change hiring practices. But since President Clinton's Project Podesta, which was actually organized by Rahm Emanuel, there's a familiar name. Some of these people never leave Washington. Actually did something called Project Podesta, which was the same idea as what Obama is pursuing now, and that is to write codified law with executive order without the approval of Congress. The Constitution makes no provision for this. The president is authorized to sign legislation and veto, and there ends his capacity for legislative input.
All right, so you say the past presidents have neutered Congress to the point that it's no more powerful than the House of Lords in the UK. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, Congress is largely of its own volition becoming a rubber stamp, becoming a body of wise old men, so to speak, that is doing little more than echoing some basic discontentment from the larger populace. And if President Obama is not stopped now, and he wasn't stopped for almost 8 years, then what's next? What Rubicon will he cross next? It was an attempt to filter the discussion at this actual conference. Some press were denied easy access to attendees. We weren't able to get interviews of attendees, save the two that were sent out, who were clearly rehearsed, clearly scripted, and clearly designed to be the media foils. So this is not an open, you can't really have an open discussion with people like Siraj Wahhaj, who have advocated replacing the Constitution with the Quran. Their remarks, when candid, are too revealing of a radical philosophy, a radical agenda. And not all Muslims may subscribe to this, but those who were headlining this conference have a history of supporting things that are not in the best interest of this country or freedom of speech.